Hi, I'm Joan Marie Verba, the producer, and today we're interviewing Jody Lynn Nye, Susan Sizemore, and Marguerite Krause. We are at the Uncle Hugo Science Fiction Bookstore for an autograph. I'm interviewing Marguerite Krause, who has contributed to the Seven Seasons of Buffy, an anthology of essays on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and a fantasy called Moon's Dreaming. And so we're going to talk about these two books with Marguerite Krause. Marguerite, start out with the Buffy. How did you get into that project?
I was invited to submit an essay, and I never have found out who first recommended me to the publisher and editor of this book. But he issued an invitation, understood I was a fantasy writer and a fan of Buffy, and I proposed a subject after he told me what the anthology was going to be about, which is basically, it's about the entire seven seasons, the myth, the characters, the whole universe. And I proposed an idea of something I thought I would be able to talk about, and he accepted it and went from there.
And what kind of subject is covered in your essay?
My essay is called The Meaning of Buffy, and I wanted to explore what I thought was the heart and soul of the series. Other essay writers talked about specific characters, for instance. Some talked about Spike or Riley, and others did overviews of the nature of evil in the Buffy universe, or, you know, powers of good. So there's 22 essays altogether. It's a lot of fun for anybody who loved the series. There's something in here that will either find you nodding your head in agreement and going, yes, that's exactly what I used to think, or, you know, this person put in words what I really believe. And some of the essays will probably have you shaking your head and wanting to argue with the author. And that was the intention of the anthology. It's a conversation sparker for anyone who enjoyed the series.
Is there anything in particular that you wanted readers to get out of your essay, or wanted to pick up from your essay?
My essay should get them thinking about what they consider the meaning of Buffy, what lesson or what message or what feeling that the show after seven seasons leaves in their hearts. And some people will agree with me because, well, I think people should read what I think the meaning is, and some will agree with me, and some will say, no, she missed the boat.
Okay, well, talk about your other book then, The Moon's Dreaming. Yeah.
Moon's Dreaming is the first book of a two-part epic, Moon's Dreaming and Moon's Dancing. This is the sample copy. The book itself is going to be coming out available for purchase in early November, and Moon's Dancing, the second book, will be out in early December. And my partner, Susan Sizemore, and I wrote this book together. We were working on it over 10 years ago when we first started inventing it, and we're very excited to see it in print now. It's an epic fantasy. It has kings and princes and queens. It has peasants who are revolting against the current status quo, and it is a world of magic where the magic is dying out, and monsters, dragons, sea monsters are becoming more and more dangerous, and the common people don't know at first what the trouble is, and as they find out, there's a pretty desperate race to fix things before the world ends.
Is there a protagonist or protagonists?
There are several protagonists. There's a captain of the guard of one of the major kingdoms named Dale, very much a hero, although he doesn't always see himself as one. There's a princess named Garey who is fit to rule, but she's not in the line of succession, and so she has to come to grips with her responsibilities, that she should take charge, even though her father, her society, aren't sure that they want her to take charge, although she is the most fit to rule. And there's just a common guy named Jody, who's a carter, a father of several kids, normal fellow who kind of gets dragged into things because he sees problems, sees they need to be solved, and no one else is going to step forward and solve them, so he has to get involved.
Is there any particular reason why it was divided into two books? Was it because it was a very long novel and you had to divide it into two, or does the story actually naturally break down into two parts?
The story naturally breaks down probably into 4 or 5 parts because a fair amount of time passes from the beginning to the end as this crisis evolves and gets more complex and the world starts to fall apart. But it really is, it's too, even as a hardcover, it would be too big in one volume. Well, at least, you know, before the days of J.K. Rowling and 800-page hardcovers. But when we were getting this published, most people said, no, you know, an 800 or 900 page book is way too big. So it was the publisher's choice to make it a 2-volume thing.
Okay, and what kind of message are you, well, not necessarily a message, but what kind of themes do you explore in the book?
The theme in Moon's Dreaming and Moon's Dancing really ended up being relationships of parents and children, because there are kings and queens and their heirs, and the children who are not heirs, and their relationships among the siblings, and there's Geordie the Carter and his kids and his approach to raising young people up to become parts of society. So even though we started it out as just a fun, epic, adventure fantasy novel with dragons and swords and battles and all the things that are fun in fantasy worlds, it really ended up being about family relationships, family responsibilities, and love.
Okay. Can you tell us about the writing of the book? You say that you wrote it with your partner Susan Sizemore, so can you tell us more about how that collaboration began, developed, and how you developed the book?
Collaboration is different for every pair of authors, because I've talked to other people who collaborate, and everyone does it differently. In our case, we talked about the world and we talked about the themes, kind of explored them verbally first, and then both of us went off. We kind of had favorite characters that we were attracted to, and both of us would go off and write an entire scene or sometimes an entire chapter, and then we'd trade them. So Susan would write something and I'd read it and I'd kind of make suggestions or tamper with it, and I would write something and she would go through it and make corrections, changes, edits, and it was just a lot of ongoing give and take. And because we talked about it together but we wrote bits of it separately, we actually surprised each other once in a while. I would give Susan something and she would say, wait a minute, I didn't know that was going to happen, and vice versa. But it worked out well because it moved the story forward, and as each of us came up with ideas, it would kind of be a catalyst for something else to happen, or for a fork in the road to take us in different directions. It was time consuming, of course, 2 people working on something, but it was a lot of fun.
How long did it take to write?
I think it was probably in process for a good 18 months, 2 years of writing, getting through a first draft. And then we revised it several times, and as we started actually looking for a publisher, we get a publisher and an editor involved, and they have suggestions, and we had our image of wanting it to be either a big book all by itself or perhaps a trilogy, and then the publisher was pushing for it to be just 2 parts. And as I say, we were working on it back in 1989, 1990 is when we were first discussing it. So that's 12, 13 years ago. 12,
13 years ago. Okay, well, tell the viewers a little bit about yourself. Especially, I'm aware of the fact that you run the Renée Auberjonois fan club.
Oh, yes. I've been involved as a Star Trek fan since the mid-'70s when I was in college. Some of my first friends were Star Trek fans, and when you're in college you get together with people and watch movies and discuss things, and so that's when I was first getting started in fandom all those years ago. And I've kind of stayed a fan. I'm interested in Star Trek and interested in all kinds of science fiction and fantasy all those years, and I've been writing all those years. And Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Deep Space Nine was, in my opinion, an excellent Star Trek universe. Frankly, I think it was the best as far as the quality of the writing, the quality of the storytelling and the world building. The writers of that show created such a complex situation and complex characters get in it. And so, during the 90s when the internet was growing, that's when I started talking to other fans online and met people all over the country. And yes, eventually met the woman who's the actual president of Renée's fan club, and I ended up signing on with her to help with things like the mailing list and the newsletter. And so yeah, it's an ongoing adventure and a lot of fun.
Okay, great.
My husband Mike is my high school sweetheart. We met when I was 14 and got married in college, and we're coming in on our 28th wedding anniversary. Our 2 children, our daughter is in graduate school here at the University of Minnesota in speech-language pathology, and our son just graduated as an undergrad from Colorado College, and he's now earning a living, trying to pay off some debts. He probably will go to grad school someday because his interest is psychology and youth counseling. So our kids are adults and kind of almost getting toward being independent people.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Now we're talking to Susan Sizemore, and she has 2 series of books about vampires, and she has a current book out in each of those series. So I'm going to ask her to talk about each of the books in turn. And which one do you want to go with first? Do you want to go with
Heroes.
Let's go with Heroes first. So talk about your book about heroes.
Well, Heroes is the 5th book in a series called Laws of the Blood. It's from Ace Science Fiction. They're dark fantasy novels. They're not horror novels, but fantasy. They have relationships between vampires and humans in each book, but they're basically about a vampire culture and the things wrong with the vampire culture that lives in the modern world. I love modern fantasy. I love fantasy worlds where the world of the modern era is a little twisted, that there are magical things that live underneath the real world, and the Laws of the Blood series is very much a modern fantasy in that it's a world where vampires exist in our world, and they don't interact too much, actually, with our world, other than taking lovers and running their own businesses and making a living. And each book is about what are called the enforcers, and the enforcers are vampire cops, and their job basically is to enforce the laws of the vampire world. Each book takes place in a different city. The first book was Los Angeles, the second book Seattle, the third book Chicago, the fourth book Washington, D.C., and this book, the 5th book, takes place in Las Vegas. And each book is based on a law, one of the laws of the blood, and this book is Beware of the Light. And it has a lot of different meanings. The meaning in the book is really beware of knowledge, but also vampires have this problem. Some of them, as they get older, or even as they get older, some of them develop an addiction to light. They become light addicts, and Las Vegas tends to be where the the light junkies show up and live. There's a lot fairly harmless vampires who hang out in Las Vegas just going, oh, look at all the pretty lights. And there are some characters in the book who are light junkies. But another meaning of Beware of the Light is there's a lot of hidden knowledge that vampires aren't supposed to know. And this knowledge is starting to be spread out on the internet and various other ways of all this forbidden knowledge. Because basically the vampire world is one that does need a revolution. That's what I've been setting up in the series of books. So, that's the current book. And my second book that I have out this month, both books are out in October for their vampire books, so they're out in the Halloween time. This is I Burn For You. It is from Pocket. It is a romance novel, contemporary, set in Los Angeles, involving a vampire hero and a human heroine. Currently, the very popular thing in romance at the moment, is blending genres. There are a lot of people who read romance who also read science fiction and fantasy. And the blending of genres has become quite popular. And there are several very well-known authors out there, Christine Feehan and Susan Crenard, various writers who sell very well to blend the genre, people who read as much science fiction as they do fantasy. And I read both, I write both, so I write historical romance as well for Avon. And so I've blended the two things I do for a living, which is vampire fantasy, with romance, and came up with another vampire culture. So far there are 3 books planned in this series. I Burn For You is the first one, the second one will be called I Thirst For You, and the third one will be called I Hunger For You. And they are contemporary vampire romance, very hot. The first one takes place in Los Angeles. The hero is a former Delta Force operative, because these vampires live on... Hi, Bill. They take medicine to keep them from acting like vampires. They can live in sunlight. They have all the various vampire allergies are taken care of by medicine, and the hero of this book, his medication needs adjusting, and he's about to go feral, and he's at a vampire clinic in Los Angeles trying to get his medication fixed, and in it meets the heroine, who is a professional bodyguard, and he and the heroine go to work for this bodyguard business, and he ends up protecting the heroine, who is actually being chased by vampire hunters, because she doesn't know it, but she has a connection with the vampire world. And they're, as I say, they are romances. But it's also, I do a lot of world building because I started out as I'm a fantasy writer, so I had fun developing the universe.
I understand that you won an award for your romance.
Oh yes, long ago, back in '91, I entered a contest called the Golden Heart, and that's a national writing contest for unpublished writers. And it's the Golden Heart I won that back in '91 for my very first book, which is a time travel romance called Wings of the Storm, and that was my first book I sold. I won the award before selling the book, and then I sold the book, and I've got 20 some odd books out since then.
So you're a full-time writer now?
I am a full-time writer.
Okay, we're talking to Jody Lynn Nye, and she has written some fantasy books, one a collaboration with Robert Aspirin and one by herself. So let's start talking about the books that you've done in collaboration with Robert Aspirin. What are those?
Well, Myth Told Tales is a chapbook of 3 short stories set in the Myth Adventures universe, which Bob started off many years ago with another fine myth, The Adventures of Oz and Skeeve. Oz is, well, you would call him a demon because he's large and green and scaly and very fearsome. And Skeeve is just an ordinary guy. He's a clod. He's from the dimension Claw, so that makes him a clod. And the two of them get together because Oz was a fellow magician of Skeeve's master, Garken, who is shot dead just immediately before Oz comes into the picture. And to sort of survive, Oz takes Skeeve under his wing. And that's how the whole series got started. They're very funny books. I've always admired them. And a few years ago, Bob got into kind of a writing funk, and he decided that he wanted to finish up the last books in his contract of the Myth books, but he wasn't sure where he wanted to go after that. And we've been talking for many years about doing something together. He decided that he trusted me, and that I was a silly person too, so that we could enjoy writing these books together. So we took a crack at it.
So the books are more lighthearted then?
They are very lighthearted. They're very funny. In fact, we had written a book together once already called License Invoked. It's for Baen Books. It's not set in either of our original universes. We set the book in New Orleans. It's about a couple of spies, one from England and one from the United States, who have to solve a problem involving an Irish rock star, the upcoming concert that she's happening, and the Louisiana Superdome.
And how does the fantasy element fit in?
Well, it's more or less spies, magic, and rock and roll. Let me see if I can remember correctly. The rock star thinks she's under a curse. She's certainly being pursued by people who have ill intentions toward her, and they're manifesting in magical ways. For example, her costume bursts into flames while she's in it, or things chase her, or wires wind themselves around her. And obviously this is not being done by any human agency, or at least nothing that they can detect.
And so how does the plot unfold? What's the basic premise of the book?
The basic premise is that the two spies must learn to work together in order to solve this problem, to find out what the problem is, whether or not magic actually exists. Each of them comes from a department of their various secret services, which is devoted to the pursuit and study of magic, although neither one is acknowledged by the public. The British one is called the Office of Observation of Paranormal and Psychic and Secret something. It's the acronym is OOPSI. And the American one is Bureau of something, which is BBB. You can run your finger over your lips for that one. So the two of them have to work together in order to solve the problem. The rock star herself is extremely uncooperative because she's terrified that it's something she's done, and she's very superstitious and uncooperative, but it's a lot of fun. And New Orleans itself is a character in the book.
Great. And tell us about the book that you wrote yourself there.
This is the fourth in my series, which is Mythology 101 was the first book. It's not related to the Myth Adventures series. A lot of people think so because they sound similar, like a Jane Austen novel, Myth and Mythology. But it has to do with a college student named Keith Doyle who firmly believes in magic and has always thought that somewhere around the corner there are dragons, there is magic. He just hasn't put his finger on it yet. So he has to find out how he can solve this problem for them. And at the same time, he wants desperately to see if he can learn magic.
And
this book is the fourth in the series. He's a grad student by now. He's got somebody very angry with him. He's got a secret. He knows how to do magic by now. He knows how to do some. Back then, Keith has to go into sort of deep cover, and it makes his life very complicated. But it's also very funny.
so this is also a book in which humor plays a
Yes.
role.
A lot of the things that I write have a very strong humor element. Even the serious stories. If you don't have levity, you can't appreciate serious elements of a story. But I do tend to write things that have a funny bent to them because goodness knows there's enough sorry and morose and unhappy entertainment out there, if you can call it entertainment. So I'm there to be the leavening. I'm there to make people laugh and let them get away from the horrors of real life.
Well, that's wonderful. Are there more coming in that, or do you have other projects in development?
I certainly do. I'm writing a fifth mythology book right now that will be turned in next spring and out the fall of 2005. And I have just turned in a military science fiction book, which is also humorous, which is called Strong Arm Tactics. It's the first in the Wolfpack series for Misha Merlin. And I'm looking forward to seeing how people think about that. Look for the cover with the fluffy pink bunny on it.
The fluffy pink bunny. Okay. And
8
how
feet
does
tall.
the military part get into it?
It is a scout platoon, which is essentially the punishment patrol for the Confederation, the Thousand Worlds Confederation. This is where they ship you when you have done someone wrong, or you haven't done someone wrong, or you know too much, or perhaps you're just really, really inconvenient, like my young hero, who is a good officer, a stand-up guy, an honest person, except he happens to be the eldest child of a very powerful family. And the military is not foolish. They don't want anything to happen to him, or they would like him to quit and go home. But they can't just send him home because he would ask questions, so they want him to quit. So they send him to the punishment detail. And he is determined, because he is young and full of lots of energy, to make this into a real unit. Now, these people have all been around the block a lot. Every one of them has more experience in the military than he does, a lot more know-how, a lot more savvy, and they're used to getting away with things. He wants to put an end to that and make them a unit to be proud of. They're not so sure they're going to cooperate.
Okay, well that sounds really interesting. Your husband?
He has been my best and biggest supporter all these years. His best, you can best describe his profession as being a packager. He puts together a series of books for editors and publishing houses that they would do if they had a huge staff of energetic people like my husband. And he is the one who said, you write, you do what you want to, and I will make sure that it's possible for you to do that. I've always appreciated that about him. I came out of a terribly toxic job and started writing professionally after that.
So essentially you're both in the business.
We are. We have houses, we have 2 offices in the house, mine and his. They're as far apart physically as we can make them within the confines of the house. And we have totally different working styles. I know a couple who are both writers who work in the same room, and I cannot imagine possibly ever doing that, because Bill fidgets and he talks on the phone, and I don't even have the television on when I'm working. I don't like any distractions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jody Lynn. I appreciate your talking to us today.
Thank you very
Good
much.
luck with your books.
Thank you.
Besides obvious science fiction elements and fantasy elements, we also like to do things with mythology, world mythology, and this one is based on the Odyssey. Penelope's shuttle. To and fro, like a broad-bladed oar, cleaving the breast of the sea, like a slender beamed ship on the back of the sea. My tears like the spume of the high-running sea, my sighs like the sighs of a flowing tide of the moaning sea. Threads flow through my fingers, the shuttle's beat a roar in my ears. The woven web shimmers and changes in the rising and falling light, of sibling sun and moon as they ride the crest of heaven. The men go forth, and the men come back, or come not at all, from the sea, in proud-masted ships and glory of arms. But for women, left standing on the pebbled shore, duty and fate never change, and the tears of women flow eternal as the tides of the whispering, wondering sea.
Despite what it sounds like, this is not a haiku. I had read an article in a science magazine about photons, and it was very, very interesting. And I had this just thought sort of at the end, and it became a poem. It's called Photons. Photons are salmon that never return to the river.